HB 2037 will lead to unjustified use of force, disparate enforcement, unconstitutional policing, and, by the way, more liability exposure for units of government.
Well, that's Tamer Abuzaid of the King County Office of Law Enforcement Oversight. He's concerned about what he sees in Olympia as a rollback of police accountability laws, which were passed in the last legislative session. But officers are saying, with these laws in place, their hands have been tied on catching criminals or helping out in behavioral health crisis situations. So, what reform needs to happen to police reform? We're going to discuss that. We're going to talk about some concerns about police discipline in Seattle. We're also going to talk about some new legislation at the city level to help our local economy recover from the COVID epidemic. It could be permanent. What are we talking about here? A whole bunch of stuff, all that and more right here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own. And joining me is David Croman of the Seattle Times. David, always a good time to be with you. I wanted to ask you about this one, though. Are you hoping the groundhog sees his shadow with this Groundhog Day? We have a longer winter. Are you hoping he doesn't? There's no shadow. How would you describe your groundhog concern level right now, maybe?
Well, I think, I am desperate for spring. I'm desperate
Okay.
for more light and warmth. So I would say I'm firmly in the, I can't remember if he doesn't see his
No
shadow.
shadow. No shadow means we got some
Okay.
spring coming sooner.
Cool.
Okay.
So I'm hoping for no shadow, I suppose.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll see how that one pans out. Thank you very much, sir. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for Seattle News, Views, and Brews on the audio podcast here. Check them out. The first floor of City Hall. Please do support them. Other small businesses, too. Thanks also to our patrons. We're hoping more of you can join in, become patrons. If you join at the $10 level, you can join our mug club. David, I believe you just got your mug. Can we toast on the air here? There we go. Clink. Beautiful.
Cheers.
I appreciate it, sir. Cheers to you as well, sir.
Thanks for the mug. I appreciate it.
Oh, anytime. 11 ounces of goodness right there. Well, Mug Club members, this is a very special part of this, get featured on our mug shot of the week. This week, it's Elizabeth, featuring her mug amidst what looks like a rock garden. Always appreciate these artistic renditions. Many thanks, Elizabeth, for sending that in. If you would like to support the show, please do, and thank you. Check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Finally, thanks to Converge Media, the video version of the podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's light this candle with right here, right now. Okay, so the first week of February here, a good slate of council activity. The full council working on passing the city light legislation we talked about last week, including that clean energy implementation plan. But David, you're the transportation reporter, or one of them for the Seattle Times. I'm seeing something on the docket for the Transportation Committee this week that really got my attention. It's a plan to extend these free permits that restaurants and other businesses have been using for outdoor cafes, etc. Those permits would be extended through the start of next year. Reducing costs, I totally get it. I want to help businesses get out of the pandemic. These permits have been available since the summer of 2020. Important to point that out. But the goal for the city is to eventually transition this into a permanent feature in Seattle. And I am as much about outdoor dining as the next guy, but I'm wondering, where's the friction going to come up here as we emerge from the pandemic? You got businesses in the right of way or on sidewalks, in some cases, parking places in neighborhoods. What does the future of this program look like to you if indeed it does become a permanent fixture for Seattle?
Yeah, I don't know where the friction would be exactly. I imagine that some frustration around lack of parking
Yeah.
would be the kind of main point. There has not been like a ton of, at least as far as I can tell, organized pushback to the idea of having more street cafes and
Right.
people kind of spilling out onto the street. And I think for the most part, and there's not a ton of polling on this, but there has been a little bit from Seattle Neighborhood Greenways that shows, quite widespread support for
People like them. Yeah.
yeah, and what's to a certain, especially in the summer, like what's not to like? You've got kind of, and I think during the pandemic too, when people felt much safer outside than inside, you kind of walk down the street and you feel like you're part of a community again in a way that maybe you hadn't for the previous few months. But I think like a lot of things that the pandemic has done, it falls into this category of this was created, a program that was created out of necessity and emergency as a way to get allow businesses to do some business that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. But now people are discussing, well, maybe this thing that we did out of an emergency, because of an emergency, is something that we actually like and we want to continue.
Yeah.
And so Yeah, and just in general, even aside from the pandemic, I mean, it's
Hmm.
hard to be a business in
True.
Seattle right
Yeah.
now because
Yeah.
it's commercial rents, like residential rents, are
Yep.
really high. We live in
Yeah.
a city in a state that relies a lot on business and occupation tax to fund its
Sure.
government, and so
Sure.
yeah, I don't. I mean, I'd be curious to see kind of the long term future of this, but I haven't heard a lot of opposition to at least seeing where this can
No,
take businesses.
no, no. I think when it first rolled out in 2020, there were some groups that advocate for people who are disabled who are saying, "Now
Sure,
let's be
right. Yeah,
careful here." I guess that's the piece of it where I
yeah,
see, okay, just being careful and such that there isn't a proliferation of these in a case where, all right, that's causing trouble there. Where do we give our feedback here? What do we tell people about the parking places there? I would like to see this program succeed too. I just think there's a number of different T's that need to be crossed and I's that need to be dotted here.
right. Yeah, but I never, and and that's a great point. But I never got the sense that that was a
Yeah,
motivation for opposition. It was just like,
yeah,
here's a problem that could come up.
could arise. Yeah,
But I think it was always in the context of this is a problem that can be addressed.
yeah,
It
yeah,
wouldn't doom the program necessarily.
yeah, yeah. Well, I hope to see that go through here over the next little bit, just to see the conversation that goes on there, and we'll keep track of that. But I did want to talk about some of the stuff that is front and center in Olympia right now when it comes to reforming police reform, I guess you'd call it. So, more than a dozen police accountability measures passed last year at the state level, two of them really causing a sticking point for law enforcement. One of them, House Bill 1310, among other things, limits how and where officers can use force. This has come up in behavioral health crisis cases. Officers say, hey, no crime's been committed. I can't get involved here, according to this bill. Then you've got House Bill 1054. It limits what kind of force can be used, tear gas, etc., but also limits how and when officers can go into a car chase. There's a lot of concern about that cops are just letting suspects go. I know the legislature's working on tweaking both of these bills this session, David, and I want to try to break this down. This idea of officers needing clarification on when they can use force. I know the attorney general was talking about this last year, saying this is what the law means, but I'm just trying to figure out what clarification is needed because it looks like just about every police agency across the state is interpreting this in a different way, and that's a problem.
Yeah, and the attorney general, I think it was maybe not last week, but 2 weeks ago,
Hmm.
came out with that he had been presented, his office had been presented with a few kind of, I can't remember exactly how many questions, but some
Sure.
number of
Yeah.
questions from the
Hmm.
original bill sponsor to address, and he came back with answers to three of them, so not all of them, a couple weeks
Okay.
ago. And as part of that, he acknowledged, he said, um, this bill, especially around use of force, could use some more clarity.
Yeah.
That, but the kind of question at the center of this, and I think the kind of real tension is
Hmm.
um, whether law enforcement agencies are kind of um, going a little bit further than, like, are kind of willfully
Mm.
misinterpreting some of the rules in here, or if this is like a sort of legitimate fear that they have that they are going to face consequences if they act on certain use force in certain locations. And so
Hmm.
I think, as you mentioned, the kind of, at least the area for me that seems like it has had the kind of most stark consequences,
Yeah.
whether this is just law enforcement's reading or an actual feeling of the bill,
Sure.
the
Yeah.
reality is on the ground, uh, for people in crisis, police generally have the authority to detain these people and
Right.
involuntarily, well, not involuntary, but like involuntarily transport them to a
Hmm.
hospital where they
Right.
would
Right.
receive emergency psychiatric evaluation,
Hmm. Hmm.
which is a whole system that has a lot of faults, and people can talk, you can talk forever about that system,
Oh
but
yeah.
it was kind of it was seen widely as kind of a measure of last resort,
Yeah. Of
especially
course.
for
Yes.
crisis responders. And
Hmm.
data across the state, certainly in Seattle, and I think across the state, has shown that since this bill has passed, police have not been doing these
They've been
nearly
backing
as
off big
much.
time. Yeah. Hmm.
Um, and so, again, you can get into why that is, whether this is
Mm.
because it's not a job that the police generally liked to do very much.
Yeah. Nobody does. Yeah.
And so you can kind of get into whether this, again, whether this is a poor reading of by the law enforcement agencies,
Hmm.
or a weakness in the bill, or whatever, but the
Sure.
facts on the
Right.
ground bear out that something has
Yeah.
changed here, and it's
Right.
not. going very well. And
Right.
so the legislature, I think, has sort of, even the original sponsors have kind of conceded that um, this bill needs some kind of more specific clarity
Yeah.
around these questions, around particular for people in crisis.
Yeah, that's a big one, and I think about this other one too on the car chases. I think this has been a very interesting conversation about officers. Do they get involved in these chases if they have a reasonable suspicion that there's something going on, or do they need to have probable cause, a higher standard there? This one's really thorny, David. I look at this, lawmakers are trying to prevent police chases, which a lot of times can injure officers. They can injure bystanders. They can kill people. It's something that can be very dangerous, but there's this idea too, okay, we need to stop criminal activity as it's happening or it could get worse. Help me with that whole idea, the concept of pursuing people with car chases, etc.
Yeah, I mean, this one is also tough, and we'll have some more coverage of this probably this week. But
Oh yeah.
the data shows that traffic enforcement is way down, and there's a lot of
Hmm.
reasons for that. I
Yeah.
mean, the pandemic was the first one, but
Yeah.
you do kind of see, as these bills take effect, that traffic enforcement among law enforcement agencies has gone down, and so there's
Yeah.
some suggestion that this is leading police to make fewer traffic stops,
Sure.
um,
Right.
which again, who knows if that's a accurate reading of what the bill does or doesn't do, but it is
Hmm.
something that we're seeing. And so,
Yeah.
I think the motivation of the bill is, if you pull somebody over for busted taillights or whatever, and then they run
Yeah.
from you, is it worth that pursuit? I mean, are you going to create
Hmm.
more problems by getting into a high speed pursuit for something
Sure.
that started as a low level stop?
Hmm.
And the New York Times had done some good work around, like, how when traffic stops lead to deadly shootings and things like
That's
that.
right.
And so this
That's
this
right.
sort of larger question around, that spurred, I think, from the 2020 protest, which is, where are the points at which law enforcement and the public are interacting, and sometimes interacting poorly, that maybe they
Hmm.
never needed to interact with in the first place. And I think this was
Right.
kind of part of that,
Yeah.
combined with just sort of the general disease that people have with high speed chases through communities. So,
Oh yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but it's thorny, obviously, and making these
Yeah.
kind of transitions isn't always going to be smooth.
No, no, and just folks, keep an eye out on a few bills here. House Bill 1735 offers some of this clarity when it comes to when officers need to get involved, meaning these cases involving behavioral health crises, things of that nature. Also, 2037, kind of trying to figure out this compromise as to when officers can use their training, use that idea of reasonable suspicion to chase after something or probable cause. Again, this is something that is very thorny, as you mentioned, David. I'm following up on it on Seattle channel as well. So I urge people to check that out. A lot going on here. Republicans in Olympia talking about a new safe Washington raft of bills. So plenty happening with this too. And we'll keep track of it. All right. Up next, more on law enforcement, an interesting study of how disciplinary standards are working or maybe not working for the Seattle Police Department. We're going to listen in on Now Hear This. Well, an interesting report last week about an audit of the Seattle Police Department to the Seattle City Council's Public Safety Committee. So, the council established an accountability ordinance for police in 2017. And the question now is the SPD's disciplinary system maintaining a timely, fair, consistent, and transparent system of disciplinary action with its officers? The answer is not completely. Dan Pitts is the lead investigator looking at this. He said there were a number of small gaps, as he described them, when it comes to SPD discipline.
Any one of them on their own don't necessarily break the system, but I think taken collectively do kind of create a picture of a system that is in need of some improvement or has a lot of room for improvement, and may not necessarily live up to the timeliness, fairness, consistency, and transparency that's envisioned in the accountability ordinance.
Well, David, clearly the SPD is getting a lot more scrutiny over the last couple of weeks, especially in the wake of the Proud Boys ruse tactics we've talked about here. But I look at this audit and I saw two big issues here. Officers who are suspended get to spread out that suspension over a matter of weeks, then make up that suspension time pretty quickly with overtime pay on the days they're not suspended. So, not that much of a reprimand there. Then there was something else here, something like 23% of the reports about disciplinary action, easy for me to say, were not in the personnel files of the officers who moved out of the department before the discipline occurred, meaning they now have basically a clean slate if they try to move to another department here. Looking at this audit and what the SPD is doing here, David, what does this information say to you?
Yeah, I mean, this information says to me that accountability and getting accountability right has been a thorn in the city's side for a long time.
Yeah. Longer than 2017, that's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of it is because it's not quite so easy as just saying, here's the system that we want, and implementing it exactly as it is. I mean, because when the city, like the 2017 accountability ordinance is actually a great example of that, which is a lot of it didn't ever get put into effect because the city passed it, and then in 2018 the city signed a new contract with the largest police union, the Seattle Police Officers Guild, and that basically changed a lot of the details of that accountability system because they passed this ordinance, but a lot of them were determined to be impacts on the work environment of police officers, and then therefore needed to be bargained in collective bargaining. And so that's one kind of competing part of this. And then you've got this federal judge that's still around overseeing police reform in Seattle, and he needs to sign off on changes and things like that. And so I think in no other area in Seattle policing has the accountability system. How do you hold? Oh, and then sorry, I should add the fourth part of that is arbitration, which is most, when an officer is disciplined, they can go to an arbitrator and contest it, and oftentimes have it reversed or at least lessened. So you've got all these different kind of competing entities when it comes to accountability, and that makes kind of implementing the ideal accountability system pretty challenging. And I mean, I have been a reporter since 2014, and probably one of the first stories I wrote was about Seattle trying to get accountability right. And here we are in 2022, still talking about Seattle having a hard time getting accountability for officers right. So it's just one of those perennial issues.
It is. And I don't know exactly where it goes from here, but I think about what you bring up there with the Seattle Police Officers Guild, which is still without a contract. That contract wrapped up at the end of 2020. That contract still not in the works right now. How does something like this, with regard to this audit of the disciplinary system, how does that affect those contract negotiations, which are another piece of this going forward? Any thoughts about that and where that lands things here?
Yeah, I don't know. I frankly don't see how the city and the police union are gonna ever sit down and agree on a contract, because the scrutiny on the city to get new accountability measures and stronger accountability measures is a lot. Again, people were not really paying that close attention to bargaining talks or union negotiations in even 2017 or 2018.
Right. But
people are now,
2020 and throw some protests in there, you bet. Yeah,
exactly. People are now, and so I think, I think for elected officials like Mayor Harrell, kind of bringing a stronger sense of accountability is going to be really key. But the police union, they the thing about a police union is, while mayors come and go and city council people come and go, it's the same people in the police union. They have a long memory, and they're patient, and have, so they are going to ask for more money. I mean, they're going to basically say, we're negotiating here, like, we would be willing to consider some of this maybe if you pay us more.
Right.
Which in the past we've seen that kind of tactic has angered the federal judge, and again, you go down this spiral where there are so many competing interests. I don't know how the contract is going to ever get done.
Right. And especially up against a backdrop of the Seattle Police Department continuing to lose officers. I mean, even after all the recruitment and retention efforts they're doing, they're below 1,000 officers right now, which are levels that we haven't seen since the 1970s. And I think there's a lot of emphasis, at least on the Seattle police officers side, to say, hey, we're losing a lot here. We need to try to find some sort of middle ground that we can bring some more officers in, because there are some areas, at least they are saying, are not getting the full public safety requirement that's in the city charter there, that's the top duty of the city to keep everybody safe. And police are saying that's not happening. So moving past that, David, I want to follow up on a story we discussed last week. This was really interesting to me. Just when it looked like the council was going to end hazard pay for grocery workers, it now sounds like they're going to continue it indefinitely. A bit of reversal here for the council, which was talking about ending this $4 per hour bump back in December. Then Mayor Durkin vetoed that. Councilmember Mosqueda brought it back out, but largely because Omicron hit. And Councilmember Herbold has been talking about this a lot too. She said, we got to wait this out. And she ended up getting a majority of votes for her view, but a divided council on this one with a 5-2 vote. David, just looking back at this, the council rejected this measure that Teresa Mosqueda sponsored. She was not present for this vote here, but ending the hazard pay bump. Your thoughts about what happened at a council level with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the pandemic isn't leaving. I mean, we have this conversation over about a lot of things, which is it's harder to take things away than it is to put them into place. And this is an area where it was an emergency response, which is grocery store workers were exposed to
frontline,
coronavirus. Frontline workers were sort of seen as heroes, especially early in the pandemic. But then also, it's a really hard job. I have worked in grocery stores before. There are hard jobs that don't pay very well, and so it's this kind of which problem is the council sort of trying to address? Is it about the coronavirus, or is it about the grocery industry?
Sure. Yeah, and their actual pay for workers.
Right. I think it's a little bit about both at this point. So yeah, I mean, I think the council is just discovering that it's still a hard time to be a grocery worker, and I guess now they're discovering is not the right time for them to cut back on the hazard pay. It does raise the question, sort of like the eviction moratorium and a lot of other things, of when does this get rolled back? And council has decided, I guess, it's not yet.
Yeah. And there are some municipalities in California that are starting to roll back some of these different protections. So it will be interesting to track this. Taking it one step deeper here, though, David, I thought it was an interesting coalition, if you will, where Council President Juarez did not side with the more moderate voices on the council, Peterson and Nelson, who say this pay bump is bad for business, basically. It was Juarez, Herbold, Morales, Sawant, and Lewis who carried the day on this. You had Teresa Mosqueda absent. Dan Strauss was absent for this voice, too. I was ever so confused about who's on whose team with this. Any thoughts about how that coalition came together and how that vote went down? I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Nelson and Peterson. Nelson's not surprising because she was elected as sort of a voice of business. Peterson too. I mean, he's been consistently more skeptical of some of these measures than his colleagues. So that's not.
And there was a QFC in his neighborhood in Wedgwood that closed down. He's cited that before too. Yeah. So those two definitely.
Right, and Juarez has a way with surprising people. I mean, she's often sort of described as one of the moderate members, but she's an independent thinker, and so I think of anybody who's going to surprise you on a vote. Sometimes Juarez might be that person. So and then the rest of the members of the council, I wouldn't call all too surprising. I would have been curious to see how Council Member Mosqueda would have voted. But I mean, I think it's also an interesting reminder that despite all the narrative around the election of this kind of moderate backlash, because Bruce Harrell did well and Sarah Nelson did well, that this still is a progressive city council. That these are that even if Juarez would have voted against, voted for repealing the hazard pay, it still would have passed. I mean, it would have stuck around because the math still favors the members of the council who are basically the more progressive ones. So this is still a progressive kind of labor friendly city council, and that hasn't changed with the last election.
What's in a name? No, very, very important to bring those pieces up. All right. Well, coming up next, the future of sound transit facing a bit of a test that is simply no fare. What does that brilliant piece of wordplay mean? Well, it's time for transportation talk. All right. that. Okay. Got it. Here I go. 3, 2, 1. David, you had a piece recently in the Seattle Times about Sound Transit saying it's on an unsustainable trajectory if it keeps up its current policy over fare enforcement. Tell us what's going on with this.
Yeah, so I mean, I should caveat with saying that fare enforcement, fare revenue is not all of Sound Transit's budget. It is,
Right.
but it is a significant enough portion of it that um, Sound Transit is looking at what's happening with fares, which
Mm-hmm.
I think a couple things kind of collided at the same time, which is
Yeah.
first data and analysis, in part by some of my colleagues at the Seattle Times, that show that fare enforcement was landing disproportionately hard on riders of color, specifically
Yes.
Black riders, who were
Mm-hmm.
9% of riders, 22% of citations, and then even
Yeah.
worse, something like 50% of misdemeanors that stem from those citations.
I see.
So that kind of created this environment where Sound Transit felt like it needed to kind of re-examine how it was doing fare enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the pandemic comes along, and that,
Right.
like all transit agencies, created a really tough situation for collecting fares, because they first suspended fares at all, and then just people weren't riding anymore. But now what they're seeing is that more and more people who are riding Sound Transit are doing so without paying. So in 2018, 2019, their estimate was 3% of riders were quote fare evaders, and now they're putting that number at closer to somewhere between 10 and 30%.
I see.
Which is quite a bit higher. And so they're in the situation where they don't have a great plan or they don't have a solid plan just yet of how they want to do fare enforcement in a more equitable way.
Okay.
And at the same time are sort of looking at these dwindling numbers of people who are tapping their Orca cards when they're getting on. And
Right.
Suddenly the amount of revenue that they are forecasting that they will bring in from fares is going down.
Okay.
And so, what that means, we'll see. They're not talking about suspending any projects or anything that.
Oh, okay. I was going to ask,
yet,
like,
but
yeah. Okay.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's the plans. The plans are sort of in place still to continue on, but it does, when you are just talking about basic operations of Sound Transit and their buses and trains and things like that. The reality is a significant chunk of it comes from fares, and those fares are on a glide path downward, and they don't have a great plan, at least just yet, to bring them back up. So it creates, what they called an unsustainable trajectory that they need to figure out. And complicating that is that the CEO is leaving here in a few months.
Right.
And so whoever does figure this out is probably has not been hired yet.
Yeah, inheriting quite a problem there. Well, thank you for breaking that down, David. We need to start wrapping up here. I got to say, I was delighted to see you on Twitter rousting some blackberries out of the garden. And folks just talking about this, I know they tempt you with the fruit in the summer, but they are planted in roots in a firmament of lies. They're a noxious weed. Please don't fool yourselves on this. But I got to ask, David, what is your secret for getting them out of the garden? I have a ton of trouble with them here at my place too. These are nasty plants. What's your secret to these things?
The secret is that there is no secret. The secret is you have to just use brute force. We cut them back. We cut them back and mow over the top of them. And maybe if you do that enough, they'll kind of starve themselves. But for the most part, you just got to get out the pickaxe and dig them up as best you can, and eventually wear them out.
I knew it. I knew the pickaxe. I have used that myself. I'm like, I'm using this on a plant. This is supposed to be for like the side of a rock mountain, but no, but it's just as hardy, both of them there. Well, thank you for that, David, for confirming what I surely knew. But thank you to that. Thank you also to our patrons out there. Thanks to everybody who's listening. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing on local politics here. We really appreciate you listening out there. Thanks for being supporters of the show. Make sure you subscribe on iTunes, wherever you might listen. Again, please do support the show on Patreon. Always appreciate it. Thanks for watching on Converge Media 2. We will see you soon.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.